Okay. You guys can hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
Good evening and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question later in the program. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, Rigged, by David Shimer. David's only a few years out of Yale, where he studied history and earned both a master's and a bachelor's degree. And he's now pursuing a doctorate in international relations at Oxford as a Marshall Scholar. But he's also managed to write an important, illuminating book, recounting efforts by both Moscow and Washington to influence foreign elections over many decades in the past. Drawing on numerous interviews as well as archival research, David puts Russia's interference in America's 2016 election in a larger historical context. He also makes clear how Russia has escalated its electoral meddling in the internet age. And he reveals new information about how the Obama administration struggled in deciding how to respond to Russia's covert interference 4 years ago. With the next presidential election just several months away, David's book is especially timely and a critical reminder of the need for heightened attention to the continued danger posed by Russian attempts to undermine our democratic system. In conversation with David will be a longtime academic advisor of his, Timothy Snyder, who's a Yale history professor specializing in Central and East European studies. Tim has become a leading voice in recent years, warning of the growing threat of dictatorial rule to our freedom. His last two works, on Tyranny and the Road to Unfreedom, described how to resist authoritarianism and trace the path of its recent resurgence. His new book on health and freedom, Our Malady, is due out in September. So David and Tim, screen's yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brad. I want to start, first of all, by thanking Politics and Prose for organizing this forum for discussion. In the difficult times we face, both politically and epidemiologically, the civil society that independent bookstores bring to us and help us achieve is more important than ever. So those of you who are watching, thank you for watching, and please support Politics and Prose, and please support independent bookstores. It's a very special pleasure for me to be able to speak to David Shimer this evening. I can't take up the normal pose that one would take in these situations and pretend that, you know, David and I have never met and we're only talking about a book that, you know, he wrote and I read. I've known David for, you know, a fair percentage of his life, and I'm very proud of what he's achieved. He's a teacher's dream. You know, your supervisor usually wants you to publish your dissertation at some point, but not necessarily before it's finished. I think David has achieved a new model in that, which I will not hold over the heads of my other graduate students ever. The book that David has written, which is a magnificent achievement, it's a magnificent study of history and a very important lesson for contemporary politics. The book that David has written began as an attempt to understand, and I'll put this to David as a question, but it began, I think, as an attempt to understand an event in the past and an event to which he was a contemporary witness. The event in the past was his Yale senior essay. He wrote about a little known moment in 1970 when the Stasi, the East German intelligence apparatus, actually interfered in a parliamentary vote in West Germany. And in doing so, I think, changed the course of history, actually created the world in which we grew up, helped to create what the shape of the late Cold War. But even as David was working on this subject, he was also observing, I think more carefully than most, what was happening in the United States in 2015 and 2016. So this is a bit where David is coming from. I want to ask David, though, in his own words, what are the origins of this book? And when did it begin to seem to you that covert electoral interference was an important subject in contemporary history?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I answer that question, I do also want to thank Politics and Prose for hosting this talk, and also especially thank Professor Snyder for not only being here, but for, as he said, shepherding through my real academic life, not only in terms of this book, but I was very fortunate. I kind of randomly took his lecture my first semester of my freshman year in college, and I haven't left him alone since. So he's been, I think it's often said, oh, this book wouldn't exist if not for this person. And maybe that's true and maybe it isn't. But in this case, it couldn't be more true. Professor Snyder encouraged me to write this book. He taught me how to write this book. He observed and guided me as I wrote this book. And it's really fun and exciting to be able to talk about it here with all of you. So thank you, sir. And thank you, everybody who's here for coming. In terms of the book itself, I think it kind of crystallized in my mind in two distinct moments. The first was when Russia did interfere in the 2016 election. In 2015, going on to 2016, I had been interning for the Clinton campaign and saw this operation unfolding, and it kind of felt out of nowhere. It felt out of the blue, and it felt disorienting. I then ended up spending the summer of 2017 reporting in Germany for the New York Times, and while I was there, I was able to interview one of the East German intelligence officers who helped execute that spectacular operation that Professor Snyder referenced that did change the course of history. And as I spent several hours with him hearing about what he did, how he manipulated this vote covertly by targeting and manipulating specific voters, I started thinking, okay, wait, maybe there is a past here. Maybe there is something that happened before 2016 that mirrors 2016 and can help us understand 2016. So I ended up spending about a year studying just that East German operation under Professor Snyder. I then went to go get my doctorate and then decided I'm going to expand the scope of this. I'm going to look at as many operations as I can find whereby a foreign actor was seeking to interfere in and manipulate an electoral process in order to change the trajectory of a democracy. And I found a lot more than I thought I would. It wasn't just 2016, and it wasn't just 1972. It was CIA, KGB, Russian operations all over the world at various moments in history. And my research took on a life of its own, and suddenly the past started to look quite different to me, as did the present. And I'm sure we'll talk about the ways in which that sort of was clarified for me, but that's the genesis of this project and how this book came to be.
Yeah, okay, we're going to follow through on all of that. I want to try to make clear first, though, because it's really important, just what we're talking about when we talk about covert electoral interference, because what you do in the book is really identify this as a phenomenon. So there's some people who are aware of, for example, the US in Italy, and there are a lot of people who are aware of Russia in the United States in 2016. But I think it's fair to say that until your book, no one had pinned this down as a phenomenon which extends over the course of a century in both Russian and American politics. So let's try to pin down first, what is covert electoral interference? What is it and what is it not? What are the things that your book is about and what is your book not about?
Totally. So my book restores history to that subject, to the subject of covert electoral interference over the past century. And covert electoral interference is a very specific thing. So, and you could understand what it is by breaking it down into three words. So covert, electoral, and interference are those three words. The first being covert. To be covert, it means that the hand of the interfering actor, so the hand of the country that's seeking to interfere in the elections of another country, has to be hidden. So if that hand is visible, if Barack Obama, as he did, endorsed the Remain campaign in the United Kingdom, that is not covert. That is visible. That is not qualifying under the study that I'm doing because it's transparent. It's overt. The second is electoral. So it has to be targeting an electoral process, a vote that determines the leader of a country. If it's a covert operation to do something else, like influence, a public policy debate around a vote in a congressional body, that doesn't count. So it has to be an electoral process, a democratic process of succession that determines who is stewarding the future of the state. And the third thing is interference, which means you have to be deploying what's known as active measures. It can't just be the passive collection of information, the passive collection of intelligence. If Russia were to hack into the Democratic National Committee, steal a bunch of stuff, but decide to hold on to it and not release it just to learn from it, that's not interference. It's interference the moment that information is released in order to manipulate the politics of another country. So with those three words as my bounds, what I end up defining covert electoral interference as is a concealed foreign effort to manipulate a democratic vote of succession. And as it turns out, that is a phenomenon that stretches across time and space, that is happening all over, that is hidden from view by design, but with time is able to be uncovered and pieced together. And it's possible to see, okay, how has this practice changed the trajectories of democracies without the citizens of those democracies necessarily realizing what was happening at the time?
Yeah, I mean, there you touch on something which I think is very important, which I want to ask you about before we get into the examples, which is the notion of sovereignty, right? So there's a basic question about what you're saying, which is, okay, countries do this. Why exactly might we consider that to be wrong?
Yeah.
What exactly is it about covert electoral interference that, if you care about democracy or if you care about sovereignty, should concern you? Because it seems to me that a lot of us in America have a hard time putting our finger on just exactly what is wrong with that. Or to be slightly less moralistic about it, what is it about a democracy or what is it about a sovereign state which makes this kind of behavior alarming or concerning or significant, to put it that way?
Sure. So what it means to be a sovereign state is to say that you're free from foreign authority, that if you're a citizen of your state, you are able to determine with the other citizens of your state the trajectory of your state. And this is something that every American has a stake in, I would say, for two reasons. The first being that it is the right of the American people to choose their leaders and to choose the people who will determine the policies and who will make the decisions that determine all of our futures. And if you let go of that right and let other states choose that or have a say in that, what that means is that our elected officials aren't necessarily representing our interests, but rather the interests of Russia or China or Iran, which degrades and undermines the very notion of what it means to be a sovereign state. You can no longer trust that your leaders actually represent you. They might instead represent foreign officials who do not have your best interests at heart. And to really get even more fine than that, what Russia is seeking to do, for example, is to sow dysfunction, to delegitimize the democratic model. What that means is that Russia's objective in interfering in, for example, our elections is to make it so that our democracy is dysfunctional, that we cannot pass legislation, that our citizens don't trust each other, that our lawmakers are quarreling with one another, which means that all of the priorities that many people, especially my age, care about, like climate change or like reforms around racial injustice or police brutality, all of those subjects, what Russia's seeking to do is to ensure that we make no progress on them, to make sure that our democracy falls backward rather than forward, which affects all of us. So both because of who our leaders are and whether our democracy is actually a functioning state rather than just an anarchic, chaotic sort of hotbed of dysfunction are two reasons why everybody has a stake in this. This isn't just about people who care about Russian politics or, U.S.-Russian relations. This affects every citizen of the United States, and as such, should be treated as a national concern that prompts a national response.
Yeah, we're gonna circle back around to that at the end. I want to place a little flag by something that you suggested, which is in a candidate who is elected with the help of a foreign institution is very likely going to expect to be reelected with the help of a foreign institution. Okay, but before we jump ahead to November 2020, which is very tempting, I want to make sure we do justice to your book and to the phenomenon it describes by reaching back into the history. In your book, you make reference to the work of John Lewis Gaddis, who is one of the most important figures in the American side of the history of the Cold War. You make reference to Arne Vestad, who has done wonderful work in the international history of the Cold War. One way to think about your book is that it's a study of the long Cold War, of US-Russian interactions from 1917 to the present. So when we add covert electoral interference into the picture of Soviet American or Russian American relations, how does it all look different? Where does it start, and what are some of the turning points that we might have overlooked in the history of these relations so far?
Sure. So I would say that covert electoral interference underlies and is a part of U.S.-Russian relations for the last century with almost no interruptions. There are very few bits where it wasn't a part of that history, but other than that, it's been not only present, but in some cases of paramount importance. So the first phase, I would say, was between 1919 and 1943, which is for the most part the interwar period, and then the start of the Second World War. And during that period, the Soviet Union, under first Vladimir Lenin and then Joseph Stalin, were interfering in the elections of countries all over the world through an organization known as the Communist International, which was an international communist body that sought to unite the communist parties of the world and foment revolution abroad. And the operations that this organization launched were rather ineffective. They just involved money and propaganda, manipulating people, but at a pretty minor scale. But they provoked paranoia all over the world and all over our democracy in the United States and Britain. This idea that Russia was seeking to manipulate our elections was already present. The second phase then emerges after the Second World War. The Communist International is abolished. In its place, Joseph Stalin interferes aggressively in elections across Eastern Europe with tactics that mirror what is happening today, what Russia is doing today, manipulating voter rolls, trying to alter ballots, spreading massive amounts of propaganda. And then at that precise moment, that fusion of US-Russian relations really comes to the fore, because in 1948, Harry Truman decides, I'm going to respond to the Soviet threat of electoral interference by having the CIA engage in electoral interference. So the CIA was authorized to engage in covert action at the end of 1947 with the express purpose of interfering in an election, which was Italy's 1948 election. And the KGB and the CIA then went toe-to-toe in that election with methods and through a rather exciting story that's described in the book. In the end, the Christian Democrats, the party that the Americans liked, won. The CIA presumed, without evidence, that it was actually the result of their work that the Christian Democrats won. Everyone in Washington, literally and figuratively, high fives and decides we're going to start interfering in elections all over the world too.
David, I'm just going to interrupt you there to say that they did not literally high five, because that had not been invented yet.
Okay, they didn't literally high five, but they said things like we were all very excited, that kind of thing. So for the next 43 years during the Cold War, the CIA and the KGB are interfering in elections all over the world, either in support or against communist candidates. And this is not something that any player in this history was ashamed of. I interviewed many former CIA officers and directors, a former KGB general. All I found in those conversations was pride that either the CIA was helping to support Democratic candidates or that the KGB was helping to, take down that American menace. And they were doing it with extraordinary means. In just one country, in Italy, for example, the CIA spent more than $500 million over the course of 20 years manipulating their elections. And that was sort of the second key phase. What happens then after the Cold War is the United States moves away from this practice for a couple reasons. One being that there's no call to action like containment anymore to contain communism, so there's no consistent reason to go interfere in elections. And with that, there's a pivot from containing communism to expanding democracy as sort of the purpose of American foreign policy. And when you say that you're only for expanding democracy, the notion of then interfering in an election covertly becomes the riskier and kind of more tense proposition. And then the second issue is that when the internet spreads for the United States, the risk of getting caught is higher. So therefore you'll appear more hypocritical when caught, and you're also more exposed. We're now vulnerable to these kinds of operations. So it's, again, difficult to say we should be doing this ourselves. There are rare instances that I document in the book where the CIA either considers or actually did interfere in an election in 2000, but by and large, we move away from this. And that's when there's a diversion or a divergence between US and Russian policymaking, because while America moves away from this under Vladimir Putin, Russia doubles down on it. So what Russia's done is rediscovered this weapon of covert electoral interference. In many ways, our current moment is similar to 1919. Russia is again interfering in elections all over the world while America is on the sidelines. Only now Russia possesses a digital arsenal to which democracies are extraordinarily vulnerable. So whereas these operations were a century ago rather ineffective, now Putin's intelligence services and troll farms can reach millions and millions of citizens in any democracy in the world in a targeted, systemic, precise fashion in order to degrade and undermine democracies. So this new and latest phase is Russia being aggressive in its interference with America on the sidelines. But again, across that 100-year story, there's always been an interconnectedness. And the last thing I'll say, which I didn't mention, is that during the Cold War, the KGB was aggressively interfering in American elections. The effectiveness of it was less, but they were trying. So even the idea of targeting a US election covertly, that's not really new either in the story of US-Russian relations.
Okay, I want to pull out a couple of things that you said in that answer. One thing which I think is worth pausing on is the notion that the United States interfered in a lot of elections. So, I mean, various of your readers will be coming to your book from various points of view. One point of view would be to say, that's interesting. I didn't realize that was American foreign policy for so long. So I think it's worth pausing for a moment on the example of Italy, which, as you say, but is perhaps not widely understood, was a foundational moment for the Central Intelligence Agency. It was their first big victory at a time when they were basically facing, as I would say anyway, a vastly superior opponent as far as intelligence operations were concerned. So first of all, give us a sense of what happened in Italy and why American intelligence officers were so pleased. And second, I want you to reflect a little bit on the other cases when the United States intervened in elections, because I mean, Italy in a way is a pretty easy one. Christian Democrats against communists. You can plausibly say that if the communists had won, they might have changed the whole regime. But there were other cases where they're not, where American choices were much less, let's say, morally defensible.
Sure. So as Professor Snyder said, Italy was a critical moment in the trajectory of this history, because it was a testing moment for America, because if it hadn't gone well, this is the first time the CIA is engaging in covert action, is targeting an election. Then if it hadn't gone well, people might have said, oh, wait, let's just not do this. So it was a real experimental moment. And what the CIA did is ended up being a template, as the CIA's internal historian described it to me, for the operations it then executed all over the world. And what happened was, as Professor Snyder alluded to, there was a communist party competing at the ballot box. The argument was, if the communists win, they'll disband Italian democracy, as communists had done across Eastern Europe. So therefore, it is on us to interfere to make sure the communists lose. So the CIA then did two things, and its effort was focused on manipulating, this is important, the minds of Italians. It wasn't about altering ballots. It was about manipulating people. The goal was to manipulate Italian voters into supporting the Christian Democrats. And to do so, they directly funded the Christian Democratic campaign, millions of dollars, through which the Christian Democrats then reached many more voters more effectively, more precisely, because they had the funds needed to run a better campaign. The second thing the CIA did was orchestrate initiatives that would reach people, Italian voters, in such a way that would convince them to support the people we wanted to win. A particularly instructive example is there was something called the letter writing initiative that happened in the lead up to the 1948 election, where an Italian-American newspaper editor decided to say to his readers, hey guys, can you please write out letters to your family and friends back in Italy saying, please oppose the communists and here's why. that idea then took on a life of its own. 10 million letters ended up getting sent back to Italy because all these different churches and newspapers participated in the idea. And that kind of interference was really effective because it was manipulating people in a way that really was tailored to people they loved and trusted. So they believed the messages they got. And as it turns out, and as I reveal in my book, the CIA orchestrated that. They came up with the idea, they helped facilitate it, and in doing so, they didn't create something, because the art of covert action, or they did, but the art of covert action isn't to do something totally on its own, it's to enhance an overt initiative. So this thing was visible. People saw the letters being sent. What they didn't see was that an American intelligence service was basically orchestrating the whole thing. So there was that initiative. They enhanced the Catholic Church's efforts to influence voters, etc. What then happens is the Christian Democrats don't just win, they win in a landslide. And that sends a message to the CIA that it was their work that won the day. And they couldn't prove it. I asked their historian, the agency's historian, do you have how much of a difference do you think the agency made? He told me they still argue about it 70 plus years later, which is a timeless pattern. No one actually knows how effective influencing people is. It's difficult to measure, but all the officers at the time assumed it was them who, made the difference. So that then starts a pattern where officers start interfering, CIA officers start interfering in many elections. And interestingly, the folks I interviewed who served in the 70s and 80s told me that they often were trying to, have the glory of the 1948 moment. Mm-hmm. That they would say, I wish people would say, oh, if only you were as good as those 1948 officers. And then they would try to imitate them and recreate the magic, so to speak. But there were more awkward moments and more tense moments where it wasn't such a lovely story. For example, in Chile, which is another operation that I detail in the book, it started off like Italy, where there was a socialist running in alignment with communists. They ran a extraordinarily extensive interference operation that was in many ways more significant than the Italian operation in its scale. The socialists lost. But then in the next election, the socialists ended up winning, and the powers that be in Washington then had to make a decision that did show their actual objectives at the time, and this was Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. They said their objective was to maintain Chilean democracy, right? And that's why they were trying to defeat the socialists. The socialist then wins the election in 1970, Salvador Allende. So Nixon and Kissinger then had to make a decision, which was, okay, let's hope this guy doesn't disband Chilean democracy, but if our objective is to maintain Chilean democracy, then we need to let him, be inaugurated. But if the objective was just to actually keep the socialist out of office, then you would choose a different path, which is try to overthrow his government and actually overthrow his democracy, which is what Nixon decided to do. So Nixon then proceeded from electoral interference, which is one type of covert action, to coup plotting, where he instructed the CIA director to do whatever it took to overthrow the Allende government. The first attempt to do so failed, although it did result in the death of a Chilean general. But 3 years later, after much destabilization by the CIA, there was a successful coup against Allende, and he committed suicide, and Chilean democracy died with him. So there are blips in this history where the rationale that the CIA was always for democracy doesn't align with the historical record. But for the most part, as a general rule, when the CIA did interfere in elections, it was with the idea that in doing so will support candidates who intend to maintain their democracy. So it's not an absolute story in that sense, but that is in broad strokes, with exceptions, the overriding purpose of these operations.
So is it right to say that after 1948, in all of your cases, it's not a matter of whether the Soviets or the Americans intervened? It's rather a matter of who won. I mean, isn't it right that in these cases after 1948, you very often, if not always, have both sides intervening?
Yeah.
And then whoever wins looks like the bad guy. But in fact, usually both sides are intervening and both sides are aware that they're intervening.
Yeah, no, I would say so. And in that sense, it becomes just about advancing the interests of each of the two states in this idea of a global battle for influence, which was the Cold War. I think that if you believe in democracy, you would have liked what the United States was doing. And if you believed in communism, you would have liked what the KGB was doing. But the idea of targeting an electoral process, of manipulating people, of targeting ballots, of spreading propaganda the tactics were really almost identical in terms of what these two sides were doing and how they were doing it. The systemic objectives differed, but the ideas were the same. I would say the one maybe difference is that the KGB, in interfering in American elections, interestingly had the objective of sowing discord as an end in itself. Of dividing people as an end in itself. And that isn't something that the CIA did in democracies. Their idea was not, we want to tear apart democratic systems with no, point in mind other than just to prove that democracy doesn't work. That is something that the Soviet Union did aggressively in the United States during the Cold War through various methods, such as staging hate crimes, or even at one point trying to plant an explosive in a predominantly Black neighborhood in New York City, and then blaming it on the Jewish Defense League in order to sow chaos in the United States. So the CIA was not in that game, but in terms of the art of just trying to influence the outcome of an election in alignment with the interests of your state, this was really a Cold War story in which both the KGB and CIA were players.
Yeah, I mean, going back to an earlier point that you made, it seems that there's a turning point after 1989 or after 1991 when there is no longer a Cold War to fight. So the CIA's actions could be framed in terms of protecting the system. They always were. But as you said earlier, once America becomes explicitly committed, not so much to defending against the Soviet threat, but to advancing democracy, then there's an inbuilt tension to these kind of operations, which wasn't there before. And so after the end of the Cold War, you're saying the CIA pulls back tactically, and the operations diminish, if not disappear completely. This is interesting. But there's a real divergence in the book, because after 1991, not immediately, but 15 years or so afterwards, you get a turn in Russian policy where, as you argue, the new Russian government, not the Soviet government, the Russian government, after Vladimir Putin, and especially in his second set of terms of office, begin to aggressively target democracies ideologically on the notion that democracy is bad for the world and democracy is bad for Russia. And what I'd like you to pull out, if you wouldn't mind, is how the techniques changed. Because over the whole course of the Soviet Union, the Soviets were very good at these provocation operations. They were much better in general than we were. They were very good at trying to pick out weak spots in the psychology of the enemy and exploit them. But there was a technical problem, which you've already identified, which is that it's very hard to reach into the psyche of the Americans all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. How do you do it? Maybe a bomb here or there, some letters, but you detail all this in the book, but it doesn't amount to very much. So something changes technically in the 21st century, and that's the internet. So, I mean, the way I understand you show a certain continuity in the technique, but a massive change in the technology. And that massive change in technology, I think, brings us closer to 2016.
Totally. And I think maybe the best way to answer that question is through the case study of 2016. But as a general notion, what the internet does is it takes these operations from being what had predominantly been local and physical. You had to be in a country to manipulate the country. If you wanted to stuff a ballot box, you had to shove stuff into the ballot box. You had to spread propaganda, you had to spread leaflets and posters and newspaper articles. You were there and you were in it. You were in a country which was limiting, because that takes manpower, that takes resources. And in a country like the United States, very difficult to therefore manipulate that country at scale. What the internet does is it digitizes the information space and makes it so that in seeking to manipulate people, you can both reach more people and you can know more people. Because like with the letter writing campaign, what made that so powerful was that the relatives who were writing the letters knew the people that they were writing the letters to. And what we all do on the internet, on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, is we all reveal parts of ourselves in the groups that we join, in the pages of which we're a part. And if you then have a Russian troll who makes that page and therefore knows that you will be more susceptible to a particular type of propaganda, that makes it so that you're able to be manipulated in a much more precise and powerful way. So that's the most basic level of what the internet does in a technical sense, but from an American sense, it exposes us because the internet not only makes it so you can target people specifically, but it also makes it so that America is just as exposed as any other democracy, if not more exposed because of how divided we are as a nation. So that makes it so that other countries can basically run open season on our politics on the internet using tactics that are natural evolutions or natural extensions of the past. And in brief, and this is really important, the three things that Russia did in 2016, and I might be jumping ahead here a little, were one, hack our voting systems with the prospective purpose of altering ballots. And in Eastern Europe, again, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union directly altered ballots. In Ukraine in 2014, Russian hackers penetrated Ukraine's voting systems and attempted to disrupt their voting process. So that's an extension of the past. And the second thing Russia did was hack and release the private information of public figures, try to out the private lives of people who are in public life. That was with the DNC and with John Podesta. That's what the Soviet Union spent much of its time trying to do in the United States. The KGB would spy on political figures. There was one instance in which, in the 1976 election, where the KGB created a fake FBI file with information that was meant to destroy the campaign of a presidential candidate by outing his private life. The same idea. What the internet does is it turbocharges it. Rather than just have one fake file, you can have 50,000 real files. And rather than just give it to a newspaper editor, you can steal them and then give them to WikiLeaks, and then they're released into the public domain. And the last thing that Russia did was spread propaganda on social media. And that, in a really interesting way, was probably the most consistent thing they did, even though it seems the most new. Because what Russia was doing was spreading propaganda through third-party cutouts, through beings that purported to be someone else. That's the art of manipulating people with propaganda. That's all that the CIA and KGB did during the Cold War. They would seek to sow racial discord, as the KGB did during the Cold War. They would seek to suppress some voters and turn other voters out, again, as the CIA and KGB sought to do during the Cold War. They would seek to scare voters, exactly what the CIA and KGB did during the Cold War. So every single technique that I've been able to find of the Russians on social media was unoriginal. It was just the fact that they were using social media and that they were able to reach more than 100 million people and doing it, again, in a precise way. So history is very present here, and what history does is makes it so that 2016 doesn't actually seem novel, but rather just the evolution of stuff that's been happening for a while, which means if there's a past and a present, you can then see the future in a much more clear way, and you can anticipate what's coming next. And that's how, to me at least, all of this starts to finally make sense.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think a couple of things that struck people as new about 2016 were, first of all, the United States was at the receiving end. Americans aren't used to that. And I think Americans are so unused to that, that the very idea that someone else has effectively chosen our president is very difficult for Americans to comprehend. And the second thing that's new that you discussed convincingly is the medium. The internet makes all of these traditional tactics much more effective. The traditional tactics were original when they were invented by Russian intelligence 100 years ago. Now it's historical continuity with a new medium. And it's a powerful new medium. I'm sure many of the people who are watching this will be aware of the research of Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who is a political scientist who's concerned with presidential communication. And it's her considered conclusion that these techniques actually determine the outcome of the US election of 2016. And there's good reason to think that that's so. So bearing that in mind, bearing the seriousness of this in mind, let's turn to the American reaction in 2016, by which I don't mean Trump's reaction, which we all know. Trump accepted this assistance and has basically presented himself as president of the United States as someone who's doing what Mr. Putin wants him to do. That's clear, let's bracket that. But what's more interesting in your book, or what's novel in your book, is your detailed description based on dozens and dozens of interviews of how the Obama administration reacted or did not react to this threat. So what do we now know about what the Obama administration knew and what they chose to do in reaction to what they knew?
Sure. So the first minor point around that became abundantly clear to me, and as Professor Snyder said, I had the chance interview 26 of President Obama's advisors who were key players in this history, who were involved in trying to defend America's electoral sovereignty in real time. And the first thing is they were all caught off guard. The notion that another country could be interfering in an American election was novel to them, which was actually not in alignment with history because the KGB had tried to interfere in our elections, but because those operations were rather ineffective, or just because we forgot about it, it made it so that, one advisor, the Secretary of Homeland Security, said, I used to think this kind of thing only happened in third world countries. And that was sort of the prevailing view at the time. So I would say the first thing I learned is that there was a bit of catch up going on and realizing what Putin was up to, even though he'd already been interfering in elections all over Europe. The second thing that became very clear is that the only way to understand how our government responded to Russia's operation and what it will mean to respond to Russia's operation moving forward is to understand it in kind of two buckets. The first bucket being efforts to alter ballots, efforts to alter actual votes. The second being efforts to influence voters to manipulate public opinion. And what happened in the summer of 2016 is President Obama learned two things. The first was that Russian intelligence had hacked and released the DNC emails. And that is something that the public saw in July, especially of 2016. And it sowed chaos during the convention. It helped Donald Trump and it hurt Hillary Clinton. And that is largely sort of, I think, the number one thing that the public now recognizes as Russian interference. But the second thing that Russian intelligence was doing that President Obama knew at the time was aggressively targeting our voting systems. One of his advisors said that it seems that all 50 states were targeted, not just scanned, but actually penetrated, so that Russia was in a position to alter voter data or vote tallies. And what I learned is that in the summer of 2016 into the fall, the obsession of the Obama team and President Obama was that Russia was going to escalate its operation toward altering the actual votes of US citizens, toward altering the voter data of US citizens, which is something that folks like John Brennan, Jay Johnson told me that Russia had the capability to do, so much so that on election day itself, the White House was running a secret crisis team bracing for a Russian cyber attack against our voting systems. But the problem with that is that in focusing on just that threat, which is what every single one of President Obama's policy responses were geared toward in the summer and fall of 2016, the emails were neglected and the social media manipulation wasn't looked into to the degree that it could have been, so that for the most part, he and his advisors didn't even realize that Russia was manipulating tens of millions of Americans across social media. And the prevailing idea was we can wait to retaliate against Russia for its email hacks because that's pretty bad. But what if we retaliate against them for that and then Putin gets really mad and decides to alter our voting systems, and that's a whole lot worse. And that was really the prevailing logic in the White House at the time, which should bother Americans in the sense that there was a decision to accept a certain level of foreign interference to prevent a lot more foreign interference. And I'm someone who believes that, the prevailing policy objective of the United States should be to have as little foreign interference as possible, not to let tens of millions of Americans be being manipulated in real time. And the second thing is that Russia's operation was bad, but it could have been a lot worse. And at the time, President Obama tried to establish a red line, a deterrent with Russia, where he said to Putin, if you affect our voting systems, you will pay consequences. Whereas today we have a president who has not sought to deter foreign interference, but has actually welcomed it, which has immense implications heading into the fall, because we now know that Russia could have done even more to manipulate our elections. And Putin now knows that if he were to try to escalate his operation, I don't think any logical human being would say that he would have to fear that Donald Trump would impose costs on him, in response, or would punish him in response. So that presents a whole new set of problems for us. But and that's why it's so important to study the Obama response. Some people have said to me, well, shouldn't we only be looking at Trump now and Trump and Putin, and that's all that matters? But it really isn't, because in order to understand what Putin might do, what Trump might solicit, how vulnerable we are, we have to vigorously analyze what happened in the summer and fall in order to understand what Russia might do to us next.
I think there's another historical point there, which is that when one looks at the examples in your book of electoral interference, whether it's East Europeans, communists who were brought to power thanks to the Soviet Union in the second half of the 1940s, or whether it's Latin American clients of the United States in the 1960s or 1970s, in every case, if you come to power thanks to a foreigner, that foreigner is your most important constituent. That foreigner is suddenly more important than your entire population. And it's not just your work, important as it is. There are a whole chorus of voices, most recently John Bolton, who have suggested that we can understand the last 4 years in terms of our president becoming not a strong man, really, but the small man, the man who is beholden to some other strong man.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, it's interesting because this is in some ways an American technique. There's a very interesting document I found when we interfered in Chile's 1964 election. There was a decision made explicitly either to help a guy named Eduardo Frei win without letting him know at all what we were doing. And the CIA and the White House decided, actually, let's indicate to him what we're doing to make sure he knows that we're helping him get elected in order to ensure that we have influence over him once he's elected. That was the idea. He didn't have to be a participant to it. He didn't have to collude. He just had to know. So that way he would be psychologically indebted to us once he was in power. This is a long-running tactic that American and Russian intelligence have used. Donald Trump knew what Russia was doing at the time because it was in the public domain. There doesn't have to be a conspiracy here. All there needs to be is public reporting, which there was. Donald Trump said, find and release the emails. Donald Trump, by phone, according to his deputy campaign manager, said, I just got to report that more emails are coming. And just him being aware of that makes it so that he's caught up in a dynamic that is very alarming from the perspective, I believe, or should be from all Americans, because that means that he is now indebted to an actor who has nothing to do with what all of our interests are, what the American state, or is best for the American state. So he has become a part of that history of leaders who come to power psychologically indebted to foreign actors. And that has tremendous implications for his ability to make policy in the best interests of all of us rather than in the best interests of us, so long as it doesn't bother the person who helped get him in the White House in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, now looking ahead to the next few months and to November, it seems that what you're saying is mirrored quite clearly in the Trump campaign. I mean, normally presidential candidates try to broaden their appeal. Normally they aim for the middle, at least during election years. And normally American presidential candidates tend to speak respectfully of all of their own citizens and be tough on foreign opponents or people they mark off as foreign opponents. Whereas here we have something very unconventional. Mr. Trump is not respectful of the American public. He calls individuals and institutions names. He dismisses whole classes of people, whole races of people, in fact, all the time. But he's quite respectful of foreign dictators, whether it's Russia or China. The nicest things he says are about foreign dictators. So we have a very interesting reversal of a typical democratic pattern. Normally you try to score points by criticizing foreign countries or foreign dictators, and you try to broaden your appeal. It's interesting, but I think it's also concerning that Mr. Trump is not doing that in 2020, because what it seems to suggest is that he's counting on winning in an unconventional way.
Yeah, no, I think that's playing out, especially in our current moment, which is there are reports now that Russia was trying to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan by paying the Taliban to take out hits on our soldiers. And I've been fascinated and alarmed to watch the response of Trump, which is clearly someone who's kind of really caught in a position I think he doesn't want to be in, because if he retaliates against Russia for doing this, perhaps in the back of his mind, he's wondering, well, then maybe Russia will be less inclined to make sure that I maintain my power. Because if the objective is to maintain your power over, to maintain the sovereignty of your democracy, all of the decisions you make look a whole lot different. Because if it's about maintaining the sovereignty of your democracy, then it's how do I get my citizens to elect me? If it's to maintain my power, you have a lot more options than just getting elected in the traditional sense. So I think that we all need to be on guard for what foreign actors might do to get him reelected, because when you think about the objective of Russia or even of China. The goal is to delegitimize American democracy, to degrade our democracy, to sow chaos and to sow dysfunction. Donald Trump has done a world-class job of doing that over the last few months. During the pandemic, during our nationwide protests, during this economic collapse, our country is steeped in dysfunction, which really is, that is as good of an advertisement you could have for foreign authoritarian states of, this is what you want for America. So moving forward, not only is that temptation there, but also we might not know necessarily in the same way that we did with President Obama what's happening in real time, because whereas President Obama at least tried to defend against this operation, and he did issue a statement in October saying parts of what Russia were doing, I think it's safe to assume, as President Trump's advisors told me in the book, which I lay out toward the end, that not only does President Trump seem to want foreign interference in the election, but if it happens, he will do what he can to make sure the American people don't know that it's happening in order to maintain his own legitimacy and make sure that it can keep happening. So we're in a much more precarious position in a lot of ways than we were 4 years ago, when there was an outgoing president who wanted to have a stable election versus an incumbent president running for re-election who just wants to win.
So for those of you watching, I'm reading your questions and I'm reading the chat and I'm trying to work in some of the elements because there are more questions and more inputs here than I can list, but I'm going to try to work in some of the elements in these questions as we get into the present. David, I want to ask you about coronavirus. I want to ask you whether the scenario you're talking about isn't in some sense already happening and just in a slightly different variant, which we don't notice. So it's striking to me that back in 2016, when I was also following some of these events and writing about them, and where I was also talking to a lot of American politicians and American voters, I was struck that the very same people who defined themselves as the real Americans, as the patriots, would say to me, would utter phrases which I knew came from a foreign country, which I could literally trace back to a particular institution of propaganda in a particular state. Of course, it didn't make any difference to tell people about that. It didn't work, but it was nevertheless the case. And here we are during this pandemic, and something very similar, an uncanny echo can be heard. Namely, the people who call themselves the patriots and the real Americans, the people who refuse to wear masks or believe in the reality of the coronavirus, are also weirdly saying the same things that foreign propaganda outlets want them to say. So I'm wondering if, the target has moved slightly, the situation has changed notably, but I wonder if the same dynamic here in June of 2020 is already present in the shape of the American reaction to this pandemic.
Yeah, no, and I think all of our operating assumptions should be that foreign actors are trying to weaponize our political discourse to suit their own aims. Electoral interference operations rarely end with a specific election. If Russia interfered in one election to help Donald Trump and sow discord, there's no logical reason why they wouldn't be doing the exact same thing 4 years later. If anything, this is a more welcoming environment. So I think all Americans need to be on guard for attempts to manipulate them in service of foreign objectives, because we have not been able to secure our social media platform from covert foreign subversion. We haven't been able to figure out how to prevent foreign actors from hacking and dumping sensitive materials, and we have not figured out how to secure our electoral infrastructure in a systemic way. So when you see patterns like the ones Professor Snyder is alluding to me, it makes more sense than anything, because what the Russian tradition is to seize upon pre-existing weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and divisions in order to get at people, to manipulate people, and to undermine democracies. And right now, the coronavirus presents so much underlying chaos from which there's so much potential to sow even more. So moving forward into November, I think American voters both need to keep in mind, A, how Russia and others could be seeking to manipulate voters, and then B, whether Russia will choose to escalate its operation toward disrupting the vote. Because for me, maybe one of the most alarming things about the coronavirus is that it is now built in so much doubt around the sanctity of our election, around whether we'll be able to have a stable, fair, vote, that there will already be so much chaos at polling places that it won't take much to just throw the day of our election into disorder in a way that was not true 4 years ago. And with an incumbent president saying the vote will rigged, the potential there, in addition to propaganda, but also to do that attack that President Obama feared 4 years ago, suddenly that's a much more tempting prospect or tempting option than it would have been when there was no pandemic and when Barack Obama was the president. So I would watch for both things, and I would expect that there's no reason why countries would let us just have an election in which they're not engaging, especially when the commander-in-chief has made clear that it's okay to kind of get in on the game.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. So I have a couple more questions. We've got 5 more minutes. I think it's important for us to think forward about what can be done in a situation where we can anticipate that there will be electoral interference and where the President of the United States is effectively soliciting it, and perhaps most dangerously and oddly, doesn't seem to be running a normal campaign, which can really expect to win, except with some kind of help, be it external or internal. Given that that's the case, what can we do not to sleepwalk in November? What are the specific things, given that the federal government is basically out of bounds, what are the specific things that state governments and American citizens should be doing in July, August, September, and October to make it more likely that we have an election that we can believe in, and to make it less likely that the loser of that election tries to stay in power?
Sure. So I would say that fortunately, there's a lot that can be done that doesn't involve the federal government. It won't be a holistic approach, but there are ways to manage this problem. The most basic one is just among citizens. If citizens are resigned and don't care about whether foreign actors are seeking to manipulate our elections, or if Donald Trump is seeking to undermine our election, that's the most basic problem. So it's buy-in from the population of, we want to have an election that we can believe in. We do not want our election to be discredited because we believe in the process of succession that a democracy affords. More specifically, looking at the tactics of the past for document dumps. Let's say foreign actors were to release stolen information again. There are various players who can make that much less effective. For example, journalists can focus more on the source of that information, question where did this really come from, rather than just report on the gossip that's contained in, let's say, another batch of emails. And that's a choice. And I think reporters recognize that that balance was off, at least the ones I interviewed for the book, that 4 years ago, they really just focused on the gossip, even though the story really was that Russia was hacking and releasing the gossip. The other thing that we can do is citizens, again, can decide not to be played. In France in 2017, Russia hacked and released the emails of Emmanuel Macron in his campaign when he was running for president, but it had almost no impact, in part because journalists, citizens, politicians all said, we just saw America throw itself into, chaos over this sort of thing. We see what Russia's doing. We're not going to respond to it. So this is a choice in how we react, and it will also fall on our media not to let ourselves be just manipulated. Social media, we should have public-private cooperation, which is happening in some ways to find these foreign networks. We should have congressional legislation, but that won't happen. So I actually wouldn't say that that's something that can happen through November. Again, mindfulness among citizens, more education, more local media, reading local news sources to figure out what's actually happening in the world, rather than relying on like a Facebook group to give you the news of the day, because that is not a trustworthy news source, and that is inviting yourself to be manipulated. And the third thing, unfortunately, is that what happens when you have an incumbent who has undemocratic instincts is that the only way to actually ensure that you have a peaceful transition of power is for that person to lose by a rather wide margin. Because what history shows in these electoral operations is that there were moments where people wondered, will there be a peaceful transition of power? Will the vote be stable? Will there be violence? Will there be riots? And that didn't happen, for example, in Italy in 48 and Chile in 64, because one candidate beat the other by like 15 points. Whereas in other instances, it's been much more narrow. And then you get into a problem, which is, one leader might say, I don't believe in the result. This isn't real. So I think that there can't be complacency around being an engaged citizen. I think there are specific people who can be helpful, but I think there needs to be clear eyes. People should have clear eyes over the fact that this will not be a traditional election, in the sense that the incumbent will not leave will not be pleased with leaving if he loses by the same margin that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. That will open up opportunities to question the legitimacy of an election in a way that is something that has happened in many countries abroad, often, across time and across space, but never really in the United States. But that is a possibility now, and we just need to accept that and learn from that.
I want to sneak in, Brad, if I can, just one more quick question, and it's about the nature of what democracy is. So we're speaking about American intervention in other people's elections. We're speaking about Russian intervention in our elections. I'm sure we can agree that as a principle going forward, intervention in other people's elections is something that ought not to happen. But that's not the only thing that defines democracy. Looking at the present moment in the United States, one could say a major problem with our democracy is race relations. A major problem is the history of systemic racism, and that the future of our democracy will be decided not so much or not only by what foreigners do and what Washington does, but by what happens in protests and demonstrations in the next few weeks and months. What I want to ask you is there some relationship? Is there a way in which your topic relates to the history of racism in the United States?
Sure. So it is so directly connected that it's essential. The systemic racism that is in our society is one of our greatest vulnerabilities to foreign subversion. When I interviewed the KGB general who I was able to talk to, I was asked him, what makes America vulnerable? And he said, it's your diversity. Your diversity and your prejudice and your racism is what we are trained to take advantage of. And there are stories in which they would sow chaos. The one I mentioned, trying to plant a bomb in a Black neighborhood and blaming it on, a Jewish organization to just tear at the fabric of our society. In 2015 and 16, the social media troll farm of Russia, their number one target were Black Americans and Americans otherwise to try to promote racist content, because they recognize that as an opportunity to tear apart America and also to advertise to the world that America is just, a quote, as this KGB general put it, a hotbed of hate and dysfunction. So in addressing our racial injustice, in addressing police brutality, systemic racism, we're not only building a better democracy, but we're building a more secure democracy. Because when our democracy is functioning better and when our democracy is fairer, it makes it so that from the perspective of foreigners, it's a lot harder to sow chaos, to sow dysfunction, and to sow doubt, and to make people question whether democracy actually works. So these issues are very related. And if we can address the domestic ones and build back our democracy better, it'll make it so that as a kind of side bonus, we're a lot less vulnerable to outside actors turning us against each other.
All right. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, no, this is great.
And thank all of you for taking part, and thank you for your input, which I was trying to work into the last 4 or 5 questions. And I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. We all owe a debt in the best of times to independent bookstores like Politics and Prose. And now that we're not in the best of times, it's important, I think, to recognize these institutions and buy books from them and help them make it through. So thank you, Brad, for hosting us.
Thanks, Tim, for that plug. And thanks, David, for really a fascinating, very, very informative discussion, and frankly, a rather unnerving one too. However unprepared or insufficiently responsive we were as a nation to Russian meddling in 2016, we certainly have no excuse for not being alert to the threat in this election year. Again, the title of David's illuminating book is Rigged. It's really one of the better covers I've seen lately. And you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that we've posted in the chat column. And there you'll also see a link to pre-order Tim's upcoming book, Our Malady. Thanks again to everyone for tuning in. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you.
Thank you.